Magnus Carlsen is a beast in the Italian game. When he's up against bishop c5, his win rate is 94%, which is just ridiculous, but it is still great when he's up against knight f6, like 75% or something. He has this trick, which obviously works for him. He's the world champion, but it's going to work great for you as well, just your average chess player. So I'll run through that. We'll take a look at 2 games, and you'll see exactly how Magnus likes to play the Italian game. Before we get started, I want to quickly mention the website I've been working on. It'll give you chess puzzles from your own chess games, so you can check it out, type in your chess.com username, and you'll get those puzzles. Hopefully by the time you watch this, Lichess should be supported as well. So if we go back to the Italian game, the trick that I was talking about that Magnus does is he pretty much plays the same setup against everything in the Italian game. And we'll quickly run through the game to show you exactly what that is. First off, he likes to play d3. This is really solid. It supports the center pawn, so you don't have to ever worry about losing your e4 pawn. And he likes to castle early. This is all standard as well. And he likes to play this c3 move. Now, Magnus actually doesn't really like to push his center pawns in the Italian game, at least not early on. Some players will like to play d4, which is part of the reason for c3, but Magnus tends to like to just relax. What he likes to use this c3 move for is maybe give the bishop a safe spot to retreat to, like that, and also just keep this knight out of jumping into the d4 square. So because Magnus isn't pushing his center pawns generally, the 2 main plans he has in the Italian game is he either pushes his queenside pawns really aggressively, or what he likes to do is rotate this knight around kind of like this, sometimes there, and play more so on the king side in a more maneuvering kind of style. So we'll get to see that in this game. Black's just going to keep shuffling his pieces, and Magnus pushes with a4. Again, he's very flexible. Sometimes he doesn't always do this, but generally it's just a helpful move anyway. Black castles. Another thing Magnus likes to do actually is he loves to play h3. He doesn't like to deal with this pin. I know that pin is annoying, so even if it's annoying for the world champion, definitely make sure you mix this move in. Normally, Magnus responds after they play d6 or d5. He'll play h3. But I guess he just felt like he had the time here, so he did it nice and early. And actually, as I say this, the other reason he did it is because Black castled. Because sometimes if you play h3 too early, when Black hasn't castled, it can be a hook, and then they can start pushing their pawns really aggressively, and you just get attacked on the king side. So that's why we see Magnus play h3 here. And here comes the knight maneuver we talked about. So rook e1 is really important for this maneuver as well, because you've got to vacate this square for the knight to jump around. And here comes the pawn play from Magnus as well. So he's kind of mixing both plans at the moment into this game. So Black responds to this queenside pressure by offering an exchange of bishops. Now, Magnus, you've got to be a bit careful here with this exchange of bishops. So Magnus likes to generally preemptively move the bishop back to prepare to get it then into the c2 square to defend the center. But here is a special occasion. So you don't always want to trade here because Black can recapture with the pawn, and then it makes it really hard to utilize this f5 square because if a pawn was there, it would be controlling that square, right? The key difference here is this Black rook has already moved to the e file. So opening up that f file by taking and doubling the pawns isn't as good for Black. So that's why Magnus decides to take here. And because Black wants to activate their rook, they take with the rook. And now that f5 square is still totally up for grabs, and we'll see Magnus utilize this in the game. So Magnus continues to develop, gets his queen to the c2 square. Again, just kind of reinforcing the center, getting his queen off the standoff between the 2 queens. Maybe you can eventually get a rook there for some tactical chances. Black brings his queen up as well, just preparing to maybe get this rook involved in the game. And here's the maneuver we talked about. So Magnus is retreating with his knight. He's getting ready to jump either here or there. Again, eyeing up that f5 square. Black brings his other rook into the game. And now Magnus offers another exchange of bishops. So I actually see this a lot in his games. He likes to get rid of the bishops in these Italian games, but it's always for a benefit for Magnus. Because you can see, once the trade happens, it's helping Magnus's knight get to where it wanted to anyway. And now he's feeling really comfortable in this position, but the engine evaluates it roughly equal. So how is Magnus's win rate so good? How is it 94%? If this is an equal position by the engine? Well, I really think the case is, one, obviously he's the world champion. So, I mean, that speaks for itself. But it's because he's so comfortable in these positions, because he tries to maneuver and get these positions so constantly. Again, if you just scroll through all his Italian games, they all kind of look like this. So when you have that familiarity, it can really help you take down your opponents, just being quicker with the tactics, better with the plans, and whatnot. So Black is rerouting their knight, preparing to probably push their c-pawn in some way. Or, like you can see, he's actually also going for the f4 square. Again, these Italian games, they can be a bit symmetrical. So because we're eyeing up that f5 square as well, you got to know that Black is probably eventually going to try and do the same. That's why we see Magnus play g3 here, basically controlling that square. He can eventually bring his king up as well, now that h3 is a little bit of a weakness, especially with the queen kind of eyeing it up. So we do see that actually straight up on the next move. And black's deciding to open the center. So I'm not sure who this favors. I don't really think black really wants these files to start opening up because his rooks are looking a bit silly just staring into this pawn. So probably not the best plan. And we'll see how Magnus makes him pay. First, he starts off by just jumping this knight forward into that very active f5 square. And you can see black, there's just really no easy way to get this knight out. And eventually, this knight can also swing over to the h4 square to lend even more support over here. So we get some shuffling. Black decides to try and get onto this d file, which makes sense. This d3 pawn could eventually be a target. So Magnus prepares to defend it. And we get more queenside play. So basically what Magnus would love is he would love for this a file to open up because then this rook could get activated. And that's actually exactly what we get. And you're going to see things start to get a bit tough for black now that Magnus has this activated rook. So it definitely is a tough spot for Magnus's opponent here because the game actually ends in 6 moves, which seems kind of silly. I mean, it's very equal. There is a lot of tension, which I guess makes the situation on the board quite complicated, and that could potentially favor Magnus. But basically, what we get is black decides to open the d file. Magnus obliges it's opening up his rook with the discovery against the queen. So the queen has to move, and then Magnus moves to the b file. Now he really wants to attack these pawns over here as his main game plan. And you can see that's exactly what he does. Black takes, Magnus retakes with the rook, now eyeing up this pawn. Black moves his queen, now threatening to take this pawn here. So Magnus defends. We just said he has the a file, but you can't be too tunnel visioned. Sometimes the position just requires you to do plays like this. And then basically black is now threatening to take this pawn. It's looking a bit sketchy, but Magnus just calmly drops to b1. Now he's still defending this pawn, and he's threatening to counterattack the b7 pawn. And it would be a lot better if Magnus gets this b7 pawn. Just think about how active this rook would be compared to black's queen on c4. And basically what happens here is black just moves to the d file. Looks like a totally normal move. Nothing wrong with that. But Magnus just gets a free pawn. Just black completely forgets about that pawn. The position was too complicated. And he just rage quits, to be honest. I don't know how angry he was, but he just decides to leave the game here. So I was just watching this back, and in the explanation, I actually missed that this knight could capture the knight here. Ignore the evaluation. Let's say you take that knight. Black takes the pawn here. It's still roughly an equal game. Again, ignore the engine. The engine is not convinced by this. The problem is it's this f5 knight that is the hero, just chilling there the whole game. Suddenly, it's a fork, and you win the queen. So that is why black decided to resign here. So you can see Magnus just a lot sharper, just a lot more calm in these positions. This f5 knight, even though it didn't do anything directly, just the pressure it exerted on the position got a bit too much for black, and then just a simple blunder Magnus took, and he won the game. So the last match we'll look at is Magnus under pressure. His opponent plays a lot more aggressively here, and he gets punished, and you'll see it's the exact same setup, but utilized in a slightly different way. So it's the same setup, so we can go through the moves pretty quickly. You'll see d3, castles, c3, everything's normal. He's playing h3, stopping that bishop from pinning as well. And here's the move I was talking about the previous game. So sometimes Magnus will just keep that bishop there, but if the bishop came here, Magnus wouldn't really want to take because then black would retake with their pawn, the rook would be active, the f5 square would never be able to be used. So that's why we see Magnus preemptively dropping his bishop back so that if they ever do offer the exchange of bishops, he has the option of just dropping back to the c2 square. So black is shuffling their pieces as well, and here comes the maneuver we like to see constantly from Magnus. He's getting this knight onto the f1 square, ready to jump in like this. But black is playing a lot more aggressive. You can see the queen's coming out. This knight is getting ready to jump to f4, and we'll see how Magnus decides to punish this. So Magnus starts out by offering that exchange of bishops again. Again, very similar to the last game. It's really important in these spots. I don't think I talked about it too much last game, but when the rook is on the e file here, it's not defending that f2 pawn. So this black bishop can exert some serious pressure there. So that's why Magnus is still looking for that trade. In this case, though, black doesn't decide to allow Magnus to trade so easily and get his knight into the game. So Magnus just continues to develop, brings his knight forward. This knight jumps in. Yeah, it's annoying. It's going to exert a lot of pressure, but for now, it's not doing anything just yet. Black decides to offer the exchange of light square bishops, but again, Magnus isn't going to take here, doesn't want to open up that rook. He's just going to leave it. The other reason, actually, he doesn't have to take, he doesn't even have to drop back to c2, like I was mentioning he sometimes does, because if this bishop takes, he'll retake with the a pawn, and even though they're doubled pawns, his rook will be active, and that's a happy trade for Magnus. So with this situation, Magnus actually decides to take the knight. Again, in these Italian games, normally bishops are better than knights, and you don't want to trade a bishop without a really good reason. But knights on these f4 and f5 squares are so strong that definitely you don't want to be too worried about ever deciding to take. But Magnus also has a really concrete follow-up here. So the pawn recaptures. Magnus now jumps in with the knight. It is a fork on the queen and the pawn. So definitely, I mean, if you can get a pawn and a knight for a bishop, definitely a worthwhile trade. There's only one move for black to keep solid equality here, and it is a crazy move, queen g6, with the idea that you let the knight recapture the pawn, but then you come in here, queen g3, the pawn is pinned because of the bishop. Black didn't spot this. I don't blame him. That is an absolutely crazy variation. So instead, what happens is he just drops back, and now he's a pawn down. So it is only a single pawn for Magnus, but the engine is at plus 2.1. Thinks there's a serious advantage going on here. And it's a bit hard to spot why, but you'll see Magnus is very clinical in how he converts his advantage here. Black starts off by trying to get active, starting to centralize his knight. But what Magnus does is just pushes d4. This kicks the knight out, and it blocks out this dark squared bishop. So this pressure on f2 is no longer relevant, at least for now. And Magnus has traded off his dark squared bishop, so it makes sense that he's putting all his pawns on dark squares to counteract that. So black decides to take, but now Magnus's queen comes in, supporting this knight here on f4 now as well. Black tries to bring his rook into the game, but you can see this is actually another blunder. Magnus doesn't actually spot it though. Let's have a quick look at why this was so bad. So I figured out what Magnus missed here. Pause if you want to try and find it as well. These are the kind of puzzles you can generate from your own games if you use the website ChessBlueprints.com. But basically the solution is if you take the bishop, the pawn has to recapture, right? Obviously the queen can't recapture. And then you actually have these two pieces on forkable squares, so the knight can jump in to g6 once that pawn moved. Now this looks complicated because, let me actually show you the whole line. Because you recapture, the knight jumps forward and you think, well, you can't do that because your queen was pinned, right? Or the knight was pinned. But you can do it because when you take this queen with your knight, it will be with check. So if black takes, you take with check, they recapture, and at the end, you're up in exchange. So that's what Magnus missed, but it didn't really matter because his advantage was so strong. If we go back to the game, Magnus played d5 instead. It's actually a very similar pawn break to what we saw in the last game because we have this rook x-raying the queen. So black decides to trade, but now Magnus gets that open a file that we were talking about. Still great to have these double pawns because this rook can be so active, activating in like a vertical way, maybe to a4 eventually, stuff like that. Black doesn't want to open up the position. Obviously, this rook would be great. Magnus can't actually open up the position just yet either because the rook was the pawn was kind of pinned. Black could have traded the queen for two pieces. So that's why we see Magnus drop back with the knight, which was then threatening to take here. So black is the one to decide to take first, and Magnus decides to take with the rook. So his plan here is to control the e file and to start pushing these queenside pawns. Again, just the common plan he goes for. But you can also see this bishop is still so sad, just so out of the game, just staring at this d4 pawn. Black's queen has to move. Magnus doubles on the e file, gets that active rook. The bishop comes back, and now suddenly it does look a bit suspect because there's potentially discoveries on this rook. There's this battery lining up the h2 square. But you can see Magnus is unconvinced. The engine is unconvinced. Magnus just plays b4, putting another pawn on a dark square. Magnus is going to have to prove that this is not scary, though, because black is kicking out this rook. It has to go back. And here comes the check. The king runs away. Here comes another check. King runs away. Normally, the queen can take this g2 pawn in these kind of sequences, but Magnus's queen is guarding that square. So it slides over, putting some pressure on b2, although the knight is defending there, and threatening to infiltrate with c2. So that's why Magnus just slides over, and suddenly black is kind of out of things to do. He pushes forward aggressively with g5, trying to start some attack. Again, there is this alignment with the rook and the queen, which could potentially be useful. But Magnus just puts another pawn on a dark square here. Black tries to get something active, maybe threatening to sacrifice on b4 here. I'm not sure. Again, you can see all these pawns are just restricting this bishop very well at the moment, and this knight is ready to jump into the game when he's ready. Magnus decides to move the rook up, and in this spot, black actually just resigned. And it's because the best engine move is honestly just to sacrifice and take the pawn. Basically, if you do anything else, just passive, well, here comes maybe that move. We also, let's see, the top engine move is actually queen h5, getting ready to infiltrate here. So this match was over. Magnus wins in a very similar fashion, what he likes to do in the Italian game. So let me know in the comments if this has been helpful for you and your Italian game. Remember to check out chessblueprints.com if you want puzzles generated from your own chess games. But if you're just staying on YouTube, we saw in this match, Magnus just avoided those bishop pins. He played those early h3 moves, but Magnus is also great at punishing those pins, so I should have a video above me if you want to check that out. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.